the whip, the shackles, the brand. These symbols of physical horror have become synonymous with slavery, and our intuition screams, absolute pain breeds absolute submission. But the facts are merciless. The bloodiest revolts erupted precisely where cruelty reached its peak. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, more than 200 African Americans were executed, 4 times the number of whites killed during the uprising itself. The system wasn't held together by this. Its foundation was an invisible weapon: words, rituals, isolation, and lies. What exactly did the overseers know about the vulnerabilities of the human psyche that allowed them to achieve total control? What is this technology for hacking the will? To begin deconstructing it, we must ask 2 questions that break conventional logic. First, why did house slaves, who had better food and clothing, suffer far more from severe depression and commit suicide more often than field slaves living in inhumane conditions, according to historical records? The answer to this question awaits you in the 5th section of our investigation. And the second question, how could one overseer, often unarmed save for a whip, control hundreds of physically strong, desperate people day after day? Any coordinated action on their part could have destroyed him in minutes. Why didn't this happen? We will find the key to this mystery in the climax, in the 7th section. This will not be a simple catalog of horrors. By the end of this video, you will have the precise 6-step algorithm for psychologically breaking a person, which was used cynically and effectively on the plantations. This is not a set of random tactics, but a complete technology where each step builds on the previous one, creating a mental prison. This technology worked like the combination lock of an old safe. Each of the 6 steps was a separate tumbler. Only by turning them all in the correct sequence could you hear the click, the sound of a broken will. You came to learn about the past, but in this algorithm, you will unsettlingly recognize frightening parallels with manipulation mechanisms in the modern world. Here are 3 key points of our investigation. In just 4 minutes, we will dissect the first and perhaps most insidious step of this algorithm: how a person's past was taken from them by erasing their name and forbidding their native language. In about 10 minutes, you will learn why the deliberate destruction of the family was a more effective weapon of control than any whip. And in 18 minutes, we will reach the climax. We will analyze the final psychological mechanism that completely paralyzes the will and witness the incredible story of a man who managed to break it. In 4 minutes, you will understand why losing your own name can be more terrifying than any physical pain. Why did planters expend so much effort on changing names when, for record keeping, they could have simply numbered them like cattle? What was the practical rather than symbolic value in this ritual? On the surface, the answer is obvious. A name is a link to family, ancestors, and culture. To take it away is to rip a person out of their own history. But the reality was far more pragmatic. According to the black codes enacted in many southern states, changing a name was a cold, legal act. The old name might exist on documents of a free person. The new name existed only in the planter's ledger, officially turning a person into property. It was a complete reformatting of a legal identity before installing the new operating system of slavery. And this explains why the system so fiercely attacked the very language a person thinks in. How exactly did banning dozens of African dialects and forcibly imposing English prevent rebellions? The logic is simple. A common native language is the foundation for trust and coordinating conspiracies. By mixing people who spoke different languages on a plantation, overseers built a Tower of Babel where revolt was impossible. Yet, the human spirit found a loophole. The imposed English language was hacked. Slaves created a coded system in their songs, their spirituals, where words about crossing the Jordan River actually meant escaping to the north, and the fiery chariot was the transport of abolitionists. This system worked like a river with a false bottom. On the surface flowed harmless religious words for the overseer's ear, but beneath them hid a powerful undercurrent of encrypted messages. The system understood this. That is why the next blow was aimed not at the mind, but at the body itself. Imagine the scene on the first day. A person is disoriented, terrified, but still themselves. They cling to their name as the last thread connecting them to their past life. Then the overseer approaches and addresses them by their new name for the first time, often a mocking one, like Pompey or Caesar, taken from ancient history as a taunt. It is a public declaration. The person you were is dead. Now you are who I say you are. In the heat-shimmering silence, he says the name quietly, almost casually. And that silence is more terrifying than a scream. The climax comes when the person doesn't respond. The first lash of the whip for refusing to accept the new name physically seals the destruction of their identity. Remember the feeling when someone mispronounced your name? Now imagine that refusing to accept a distorted name is punished with pain. The first step of the algorithm is complete. Identity has been erased through a name change, and communication has been hindered by a language barrier. The person has been turned into an object, a blank slate. But even a blank slate has a body that remembers freedom and a will that instinctively resists violence. To suppress them, there was a special, standardized process. This brutal ritual of adaptation was aimed at destroying the will through pain and fear. It was called seasoning, and it was meant to erase everything human from a person. It's a financial absurdity. Why would planters, for whom a slave was expensive property, deliberately destroy nearly a third of their assets during the seasoning process? Mortality from disease and punishment reached 30%. On the surface, they called it necessary shock therapy for adapting to the new climate and work. But the true purpose was not physical, but psychological. Seasoning was a cruel filter that weeded out not only the weak, but also the morally unbroken. The death of one defiant person in front of hundreds of others was a graphic lesson. Your life is worthless. For those who survived but did not surrender, there were other tools, a humiliating collar with a bell that turned every step into a reminder of their bondage. But even that was not as effective as the public theater of cruelty. Why was the entire plantation, including women and children, forced to watch the whipping of one person? Why did this spectacle need hundreds of spectators? From the victim's perspective, it was agony and humiliation designed to break their will. But the real target of this ritual was the audience. Every blow on another's back was a blow to the psyche of the crowd, implanting a single thought: this will happen to me. It worked like an echo of pain. The physical pain was felt by one, but its psychological copy, fear, spread in waves, paralyzing hundreds of people at once. In their diaries, planters cynically described the pedagogical effect of such events. They weren't punishing, they were teaching. And this lesson proved that even the strongest bonds could not protect you from the system. But the whip was just one tool. Another, quieter one was no less effective: hunger. And here again, a paradox. Why weaken a worker from whom you need maximum productivity? The answer lies in the aftermath of rebellions. After every uprising, like Nat Turner's rebellion, the system would frantically tighten its control over food. It was a preemptive weapon. A weakened body produces a weakened will. Frederick Douglass wrote that his monthly ration consisted of just 8 pounds of pork and 1 bushel of cornmeal. A person whose every thought is consumed by survival is physically incapable of planning a revolt. Hunger turned a potential fighter into an exhausted animal. The second stage of the algorithm is complete. The body has been trained to obey through pain and weakness. The will for individual resistance has been suppressed through the theater of public cruelty. The person is physically broken, but they have one last pillar of support: their family, their community. Trust and mutual aid were the greatest threats to total control. The system understood this. The body is broken, but the soul still seeks support in loved ones. The system's next step is to destroy the very possibility of having loved ones. The figure is staggering. Over 50% of enslaved children were forcibly separated from their mothers before the age of 13. Why did the system deliberately inflict this monstrous trauma on an industrial scale? The obvious answer: the family is a unit of trust, a means of passing down memories of freedom and a culture of resistance. It had to be destroyed. But the planters' ledgers reveal a colder truth. It was an economic strategy. A child who grew up without a mother's love, with no family ties, was psychologically more pliable. It was the preemptive manufacturing of a person who knew nothing but slavery. In his diary, one planter cynically discussed the expediency of selling children, proving the conscious nature of this method. And this same inhuman logic turned the love between adults into the most effective weapon of control. It seems like a paradox. The system, aiming for the atomization of society, often encouraged marriages between slaves. Why? The simple benefit is obvious. A married man is less likely to think about escaping, and his children automatically become the owner's property. But the diabolical mechanics ran deeper. The threat of selling a wife or child was the most effective whip, one that didn't even need to be used. A single hint from the overseer could make a man work to the point of exhaustion, abandon thoughts of rebellion, and even inform on others. The family was transformed from a source of strength into a hostage. The system turned family ties into an invisible chain. The stronger the love, the shorter and stronger the chain that bound a person to the plantation. Having turned the family into a vulnerability, the system then targeted the final connection: trust between neighbors. To do this, it created the illusion of choice. And now I will ask you a question. Don't rush to answer. Just imagine for a moment. Imagine that the most precious thing you have, your family, is being used as a hostage. The overseer says, "Work twice as hard, and I won't sell your son. Stay silent about the conspiracy, and I won't touch your wife." What choice do you make? A rebellion that would almost certainly get them killed, or submission for the sake of their phantom safety? There is no right answer. This is the essence of the mental prison. Any choice leads to defeat. Whatever choice you just made in your mind, that is the feeling millions of people lived with every single day. The third stage of the algorithm is complete. The family is destroyed or turned into a vulnerability. Trust within the community is undermined. The person is now not just physically broken. They are psychologically alone and isolated. But even a lonely and broken person can, deep down, understand that what is happening is unjust. Their mind can still question the rightness of the system. Therefore, the next blow must be struck against their consciousness. The fourth step of the algorithm is the creation of a matrix of lies, a technology of total gaslighting and propaganda aimed at making the slave believe their situation is natural and even beneficial. The person is alone, but their mind is still free. The system's next step is to capture it as well. How do you make millions believe their suffering is a blessing? The system used the most powerful tool of gaslighting, a psychological manipulation that makes the victim doubt their own perception of reality. And to do this, the most sacred authority was hacked. On the plantations, preachers would read specially selected Bible verses to the slaves, verses where slaves were commanded to obey their masters. Submission was declared a Christian virtue, and rebellion a mortal sin. Using the so-called curse of Ham, as theological justification. When everyone around you, from the overseer to the priest, repeats the same lie, the mind begins to surrender. But what happened to those who received a little more information and saw this hypocrisy? And here is the answer to our first puzzle. House slaves, who had better food, suffered from depression more often than field slaves because they lived in a state of unbearable cognitive dissonance. They saw freedom but could not attain it. They wore a mask of submission 24 hours a day, deprived even of the solidarity that field slaves had. They were alone in plain sight. For them, knowledge became not liberation, but a curse. Frederick Douglass, having secretly learned to read, wrote in 1845, "Literacy revealed to me the full depth of my slavery." This is not a metaphor, but a description of the unbearable pain of realizing the truth in solitude. And that is precisely why the system feared knowledge so much. The planters' panic-stricken fear of an educated slave gave rise to some of the most brutal laws in the South, laws forbidding anyone to teach slaves to read. Literacy didn't just provide access to abolitionist ideas. It provided practical tools for resistance, the ability to forge a pass to escape, to read maps, to coordinate actions through letters. It was a direct threat to the system's economy. Illiteracy worked like a greenhouse with blacked-out panes. No light of truth from the outside world could penetrate, allowing the system to cultivate the ideas of submission it needed in complete isolation. Now that the mind was locked away, it was time for fine-tuning behavior. The fourth stage of the algorithm is complete. The person's consciousness has been captured. Reality has been distorted through gaslighting, and alternative sources of information have been blocked. The person is isolated, broken, and misinformed. Now the system no longer needs to constantly resort to brute force. When the basic settings in the mind have been altered, it can move on to fine-tuning behavior. The fifth step is creating the illusion of control through a diabolical game of carrot and stick. The mind is in a cage. Now the overseer doesn't need a whip to control the puppet. He needs strings. In a system built on absolute violence, how did rewards, not punishments, suddenly become the most effective tool of control? At first glance, it was simple behaviorism. Planters, drawing on the practice of animal training, realized that positive reinforcement shapes behavior just as well as a whip. It looked like progress. Instead of constant floggings, a slave could get an extra ration or a short rest. But the ledgers reveal the cynical economics of this humanism. The loss of productivity from a punished slave cost $1 to $2 a day, equivalent to $30 to $60 today. The cost of the carrot, an extra portion of molasses, was less than 5 cents. A minimal investment in hope yielded maximum productivity. The right to wear shoes instead of going barefoot became a status symbol, paid for with loyalty. This economic model created a new invisible currency on the plantation, and it was more terrifying than money. The real currency for which privileges were bought was not diligence, but betrayal. The ability to inform on a neighbor, reveal a conspiracy, or turn in a fugitive was the fastest path to a reward. The system created a hierarchy where foremen emerged from among the oppressed themselves. They were given power, better conditions, and a semblance of respect. This was a career path built on the destruction of trust. The system that deliberately separated over 50% of children from their mothers took the next step of turning the community into a network of informants. The trust necessary for a conspiracy was destroyed. This policy worked like soil erosion. First, the large rocks of family ties were removed, and then the small particles of friendship were washed away, until only the barren dust of individual fear remained. The system made the slaves control each other. In the narratives of former slaves, there are stories of conspiracies foiled by an informant who was tempted by the promise of new boots. Freedom, sold for a pair of shoes. Have you ever had to choose between your own benefit and loyalty to a friend? Promotion became a form of even crueler slavery. A slave who became a foreman seemed to have won. He no longer worked in the fields. He had better food, and the whites addressed him with a degree of respect. He thought he had outsmarted the system, but the real price of his success was absolute. Now it was his duty to punish his own people. He had to whip those with whom he had shared a cabin the day before. He was hated by the slaves who saw him as a traitor, and despised by the whites, who saw him as merely a tool. He found himself in complete social isolation, trapped between two worlds. Although the foreman didn't wear a humiliating collar with a bell around his neck, it began to ring inside his head. Every move he made was watched by both sides. He had become the least free person on the plantation. 5 stages of the algorithm are in place. After such pressure, one would logically expect an accumulation of rage, but instead, overseers often saw apathy. Why? On the surface, the answer is simple: total exhaustion. People who were stripped of their names, physically broken, separated from their families, and deceived by propaganda simply had no strength left. But that's not the whole truth. These were not 5 separate tactics, but a single system where each step amplified the previous one. The destruction of a name made seasoning more effective. Atomization prevented finding support. Gaslighting justified the cruelty. And the carrot and stick destroyed the last pockets of resistance. The system was designed not to instill fear, but to prove to the victim the complete meaninglessness of their actions. All of this was merely preparation of the mind for its final state. In exactly 3 minutes, we will reveal the name of this last psychological mechanism that turns a person into a voluntary prisoner of their own mind. This final mechanism has a scientific name: learned helplessness. In 1907, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted an experiment. Dogs in a cage were given an electric shock. At first, they tried to escape. But when all attempts failed, they simply lay down on the floor and whimpered, even when the cage door was opened. They had learned that their actions were meaningless. The entire plantation system was a giant Seligman experiment, stretched over generations. Each of the 5 preceding steps was an electric shock that proved to the brain resistance is futile. In the final stage, the humiliating collar with a bell was no longer needed. Its ringing echoed inside the skull, signaling the futility of any lunge toward freedom. It's like water freezing. At first, it just cools down but remains a liquid. But at a critical point, its molecules stop moving, turning into ice. So too, the will, after numerous blows of cold, did not simply weaken. It froze, entering a state of paralysis. But what if this mental prison could be blown up from the inside with a single act? There was a man, the perfect product of this system, who found a way to do it. His name was Frederick Douglass. In 1833, he was sent to Edward Covey, a professional slave breaker. Douglass was the ideal product of the algorithm. Broken, apathetic, he had lost hope and was contemplating suicide. His spirit was dead. The system had won. But on one humid August day, Covey tried to beat him again, and something snapped. Douglass fought back. Their struggle lasted nearly 2 hours. The slave and the overseer fought as equals until an exhausted Covey retreated. On that day, Douglass wrote, the slave became a man. The physical victory was secondary. The crucial change happened in his mind. With one action, he destroyed the axiom, "My actions are meaningless." This fight did not bring him freedom, but it did something more. It exposed the fundamental vulnerability of the entire system of psychological control. Why was a fight that didn't lead to escape more important than hundreds of failed escape attempts? Douglass remained Covey's slave. So, where was the hack? On the surface, it was an act of self-respect. He defended his dignity. Covey never laid a hand on him again. It seems like a simple story about the power of the human spirit, but the real mechanism lay in the realm of neurobiology. Learned helplessness severs the connection between action and result. With his act, Douglass created a new connection. My resistance, Covey retreats. He proved to his own brain that this link exists. He reclaimed his agency. He stopped being an object upon which actions were performed and became a subject who acted himself. The mental click, the decision to fight back, was an act of liberation. It was a crack in the monolithic wall. How could one man, without physically destroying the system, expose its greatest myth, the myth of its omnipotence? At first glance, his story offers hope. It shows that you must never give up. But that's not the whole truth. Douglass's act was a blueprint for the hack. The system works as long as the victim is predictable. They either submit or try to run. An unpredictable act of direct resistance breaks the overseer's script. The most complex psychological prisons have the simplest keys. The vast machine of the plantation, with its economy and laws, proved vulnerable to the internal decision of a single person. By the 1830s, this machine controlled over 2 million lives. But its algorithm did not die with slavery. It is alive, and in the finale, we will show you where you can find it today. We have taken this machine apart piece by piece. Now let's reassemble it to see the complete blueprint. This was not chaotic cruelty, but a calculated system. Step 1. The destruction of identity. Changing names and languages was not just a humiliation, but a complete reformatting of the personality. It turned a person into a blank slate, ready for new rules to be written on it. Step 2. The seasoning process. This was not just punishment, but a calibration by terror. Its goal was to imprint upon the consciousness, through shock and awe, the axiom of the master's omnipotence and one's own worthlessness. These 2 steps created the ideal clay for molding submission, a person without a past, paralyzed by primal fear. But fear alone was not enough. For control to become absolute, this nullified personality had to be placed in a vacuum. After this nullification, the system's main task was to prevent this blank slate from being filled with anything but the master's will. Step 3. The atomization of society. The deliberate destruction of families and communities deprived a person of their last support and the ability to trust anyone. An isolated individual is immeasurably easier to control than a cohesive group. Step 4. Gaslighting and an information blockade. Through religion and pseudoscience, a distorted reality was created where slavery was the natural order of things. This was an information cocoon that deprived the victim of even the thought of an alternative. The person was left alone to face a hostile reality they could neither verify nor challenge. And once they were broken and isolated, the system shifted from brute force to fine-tuning. The system completed its work by moving to the highest level of manipulation. Step 5. The carrot and stick system. This was not humanism, but the creation of an illusion of choice and career advancement. It encouraged informing, forcing slaves to control each other and destroying the last remnants of solidarity. Step 6. Learned helplessness. This was the logical outcome. When all attempts to change one's life fail, the brain itself switches off the will to fight. The person becomes their own jailer. It was a complete, well-thought-out system where each element reinforced the others, creating a nearly perfect machine for destroying the human spirit. And precisely because it is a system, its elements can be seen today. 3 alarming parallels in abusive relationships, in corporate tyranny, and in totalitarian cults. We have deconstructed the entire system from beginning to end. Now, the main question for you, and it requires an honest answer. What, in your opinion, was the overseer's most terrifying and effective weapon? The physical chains that bound the body, or the mental ones that paralyzed the will? Write just one word in the comments below this video. Chains or thoughts? No explanation, just your verdict. Let's see what we truly fear more, and what lesson we've learned from this story. Because to understand where the most dangerous shackles lie is to take the first step toward never letting them be placed on you or on others.